This lecture is going to be on Martin Buber, probably one of the most prominent doves and owls within the Jewish tradition. Buber was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize a variety of times, interesting enough, by Hermann Hesse, who we'll be looking at a little later in the lecture as we bring it to a close. But Martin Buber, as a Jew, grew up in a period of time in which there was the emergence, after centuries of Jews being marginalized, ghettoized, mistreated, seen as the scapegoats for problems in other parts of the world, pogroms launched against them. Buber grew up in Germany, late 19th century, and this was a period of time in which Christian Zionism was emerging under Theodor Herzl, and many Jews who had faced persecution, marginalization in the Jewish diaspora from the 2nd century really up to the 19th century were asking questions about how do we prevent this from occurring again and always being treated as the problem in a society. And when a society or culture is going through difficult times, the Jews are always accused as being the problem and hence persecuted and the scapegoats in that sense. And so by the late 19th century, Theodor Herzl and others, largely influenced by the emergence of Christian Zionism, began to ponder how the Jews themselves could organize in a meaningful manner to find places by which, as a people, they could live together rather than being scattered at odds with one another and, as I mentioned earlier, scapegoats of cultures, states, countries they live in. So Martin Buber, as a young man, was very drawn to this form of Christian Zionism. It was very infant at the time. It was just emerging under Theodor Herzl. But he also came to see very clearly that as this idea of Christian Zionism began to take feet and walk, it led to, just as the Jews had been treated as objects of derision, certain forms of Christian Zionism were beginning to see non-Jews or Gentiles or the others as objects initially of persecution, hence keep your distance from them, because in time when there are cultural clashes, Jews will be seen as the problem. Synagogues will be attacked, burned, whatever. And so Buber began to question, is this way of looking at reality, does it lead to a peaceful way of people living together? And so Buber's great work in the 1920s, published much the same time as Martin Heidegger's Being in Time or Sein und Zeit, is one of the foundation philosophic works of the 20th century, I and Thou, or Ich und Du in German. And Buber argued there are two ways that we relate to other people in terms of attitudes, or what he calls German's Haltung. Okay, we can see the other as someone to be attentive to respect, to hear, who is trying to express a way of being, both in thought, word, and deed. And as their thou-ness comes to us, we at our best should be there, attentive, listening to their soul, not always the words that are spoken, but the soul and spirit as it's attempting from the depths to speak out a life direction. This I-thou relationship for Buber was the highest, in which you didn't demean, you didn't caricature, didn't distort another person for the purpose of ideology or nationalism or ethnicity or anything else. The dangers that people could slip into I-it relationships, ich und es, in which one group was seen as the better, the truer, others were judged, they were demeaned, they were marginalized, they were rejected. And so these two attitudes Buber articulated, we have to be careful that we're aware that we don't reduce reality to I-it relationships in which we keep a distance from people who we're not comfortable with. Of course, this was also, he was not only talking about politically, but science itself as a way of knowing was an I-it. The idea was you detach yourself, you become more distant from that which is being studied, and the theory is you're going to have objective information. And so that distancing from the other, a certain form of science argued that objective truth will emerge. Buber argued, no, it's by participating in a meaningful way with the other that we truly understand, and the I-thou is the way of wisdom and the way of love. The I-it is the way of knowledge and information and statistics and facts. So for Buber, the I-thou, the I-it distinction was not only important as how we see reality and how we approach the others in terms of trying to make sense of our life journey. It was also very applicable for politics and interpersonal relationships. Buber argued there were 4 spheres in life that we all have to make sense of, one form or another, if we're going to be mature human beings, or humanists in the best sense of that word, because Buber came out of the best of the Jewish humanist tradition as a dove, as an owl, as a peacemaker in his own thinking. So the 4 spheres that people can ignore them, but it doesn't mean they go away. There's the I-thou of other people, or the horizontal, or the interpersonal element of life, and that inevitably then extends through friendships, it extends through family, it extends through communities, extends through national and international issues. And so it's the horizontal dimension of life in which we either engage in I-it relationships, which often lead to misunderstandings and worst-case scenarios, the caricaturing of other people, isolating oneself into various groups by reducing them to I-it, or engaging in meaningful I-thou relationships, particularly with the other who's seen as the enemy, the other who's seen as the problem. And the test for meaningful I-thou relationships is how we are willing to listen to those which often are the hardest to listen to, the most difficult to listen to, the opposition, the enemy, the opponent, who would hurt and reduce us to an I-it relationship. So what happens when the other is quite content to reduce us to an I-it, and we're trying to engage in I-thou? These become complicated relationships. And Buber was acutely aware of how people can flip very quickly into an I-it. And the hard work involved in overcoming that lower level of knowing and human interactions takes immense effort, but it's the only means of peacemaking, just peacemaking. The second level for Buber is we live in a physical world. So what's our relationship to nature? Is it an I-thou, in which we see nature as having a nature? And what's the relationship to treating it as an it, for profit, for prosperity, for wealth, and eventually polluting it and global warming, versus treating it as a thou in terms of having its own reality? And then how do humans live dialogically with that without slipping on the one hand into a crude realism or a naive romanticism? And so this is the second level, humans' relationship to nature itself. Then there's the vertical dimension, the relationship of people as they try and sort out their sacred journey, their spiritual journey, their religious journey. And of course, some just basically will have a leaden ceiling over the larger issues of the human longing to know and to make sense of their spiritual journey, their religious journey. And for Buber, if a person does that or caricatures the bigger issues of theology and the spiritual journey, then they're reducing it to an I-it. They're not being attentive to the bigger vertical elements of the life journey. And then the third is the internal journey. What part of ourselves are we listening to? Are we listening to the thou deep in, or are we just working out of a fairly superficial understanding of the self? So what part of us do we listen to? Do we respond to? Are we attentive? Are we attentive to, in that sense? So 4 are the spheres that Buber saw as very important. The trajectory or spectrum of the horizontal, the relationship of humans and nature, the natural world itself, the vertical dimensions, and then the inward journey itself. And so, how does the I, thou, I, it play itself out? So Buber's great work, I, thou, in the 1920s was very significant for political reasons and obviously for peacemaking, for what was going to be Buber and the Jewish journey itself. By the late 1920s and 1930s, Buber was probably the most prominent Jewish intellectual in Germany. He set up the centers Frankfurt, where if anyone flies to Germany today, most people fly into Frankfurt. And so Buber set up various forms of schooling and education for Jews as they were trying to reclaim their heritage, their history, the rich biblical tradition, their mystical tradition, their exegetical, philosophical tradition of Philo, Maimonides, the Hasidic tradition, the Kabbalistic tradition, all of these. So he was this sort of a key person in German intellectual life. And of course, as the 1930s moved on, the Jews were treated as its by the Germans, or certain elements of the German population, not all Germans. There's a whole philo-Semitic tradition in Germany, as well as an anti-Semitic tradition. This is important to understand as well. But the Jews were very, very much treated by many Germans, and certainly with Hitler's Mein Kampf and works that, interesting enough, Mein Kampf, I and Thou, and Being in Time, these are all come out of the 1920s in Germany. But Buber's philosophical distinction then between I-thou relationships and I-it, he experienced, as did many Jews, in a very raw and graphic way, what it meant to be treated as an it. And of course, as Hitler, the National Socialist, accelerated in power, the treatment of the Jews was appalling. And so Buber saw played out very graphic way that one engages in I-it relationships. Peacemaking, just peacemaking, is impossible, because one group of people are subordinated as objects for the purpose of being sacrificial lambs, in this case, to explain why Germany was going through such a difficult place. And they weren't interested in I-thou relationships. But as Buber moved from sort of the philosophical understanding of I-thou as applied to certain forms of knowing in science and the humanities, and then experiencing it politically in Germany, philosophy met practice in a pretty crude and way in which the Jews were its, they were objects. And so as the 1930s moved on then, and of course Kristallnacht in 1938 occurs, the Jewish population realized that Buber was very much a shepherd to the flock, and the Germans were wanting to, it was a matter of time before, if you kill the shepherd, or you send the shepherd to camps, then the sheep will scatter. And so Buber was spirited out of Germany in 1938, and he actually was one of the founders of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, sent to what was then called Palestine at the time. Now, important thing to note here in terms of just peacemaking, Buber's theory about peacemaking and the way meaningful peace takes place between people, both one's own people and then people of different ideological, political, religious persuasions. He's experiencing it historically, or his thrownness is one in which the theory very much meets experience. As a result of the theory and experience with Martin Buber, he goes to Palestine. Of course, what's happening in Palestine in this period of time, late 1930s, 1940s, there's massive immigration to Palestine, some coming out of Germany, obviously, others from Russia, others from Europe. Jews are rounded up like cattle in many parts of the world, so it's quite understandable. Now, of course, there's a population in Palestine at the time, the Palestinians, who had lived there for centuries, and this rapid immigration process led to a clash of people. The tension always was that just as the Jews had been treated as its, or objects, in Russia, Germany, France, England, other parts of Germany, now they were in power, they then would treat the Palestinians as its, because they were in a position of authority, increasingly of political power, being supported, post-Balfour Declaration, United Nations coming along and supporting this. So Martin Buber argued, unlike many of the Jews at the time, which he clashed with constantly, is that we know what it means to be treated as its, as objects, to be marginalized, ghettoized. So what's the relationship of I, thou, I, it relationships as Jews to our treatment of the Palestinians? And Buber was at the forefront again and again as more and more Jews were emigrating to what was to become Israel, and finally it becomes a state in 1948, arguing against the growing military establishment Jewish leadership that was reducing Palestinians to its, arguing, no, we must treat them as thous. We know what it means to be treated as its. So why would we treat others as its when we know the painful and tragic experiences of that? And if we're going to be peacemakers, we must see them in I-thou relationships. If we see them as its, then that's going to just further conflict. It's going to further violence. It's going to further terrorism, as the Palestinians feel they're treated as its, and they're going to treat us as its. And so the way we were treated in Germany, we're now going to be treated the same way, only we're the ones with the power, and then we're going to, of course, call them the terrorists, but we, meanwhile, have treated them as its, taking over various villages, parts of their territories. And so for Buber then, and there were others in what was to become Israel in 48, he argued that if we do not follow an I-thou way of thinking and treatment of the Palestinians, we're going to slip into a mutual relationships of I-it. We treat the Palestinians as it, they treat us as its, conflict, violence, terrorism, and then what really continues today in the state of Israel and East Jerusalem, West Bank, Gaza, and the many Palestinians in refugee camps today. So Martin Buber, in not only his philosophical way of looking at life, politically, we also can look, of course, at how this is applied to nature. You treat nature as an object to exploit for profit, you pollute it, then we live with the implications we are today with global warming. If we don't listen to ourselves at a deeper level, then we treat ourselves as it, and we try and find meaning and see others as objects for our own fulfillment. Buber's theology of I and thou is that be careful when one talks about God as an object. God can only be known in an I-thou relationship. When one does theology, philosophy, as if it's a bunch of ideas we dissect, we think about into various forms of exegeting texts, various ways of defining God, images of God. For him, the experience, and this, of course, Buber is a great existentialist philosopher, existentialist theologian. One only knows in reality, in a meaningful sense, to the degree we're willing to encounter. So reality, for Buber, in German it's called das Wissen. Reality is what happens between people when they're truly being an I to the other's thou. And when that is not happening, we enter into a lower level of reality itself. I'll conclude with one of Buber's reflections on Genesis with the Adam and Eve myth. In the Adam and Eve, to give him a sense of his understanding of the I-thou with God in that journey. Adam and Eve's story, of course, in Genesis, the early chapters of Genesis, you have God telling Adam and Eve, don't pick from the fruit of certain, the tree is, of course, the tree is one of those great symbols, mythic symbols of the tree of the soul. And where do the roots of our soul go? If they're not deeply rooted, then the tree of who we are can be blown over by the winds and storms of time. But the tree symbol, very, very significant, both in biblical tradition and comparative mythological traditions. But the Genesis myth or story, in that sense, remembering myth is not a falsehood, it's an eternal truth wrapped in the garments of a story. God tells Adam and Eve is that pick from the fruit of the tree of your desires. Many of them are good to be enjoyed, they're nutritious, and enjoy them, but don't indulge in certain wants or inflated desires, because you'll begin to lose your sense of even discerning how to make proper decision. Of course, the serpent comes as an angel of light, inevitably saying, oh, come on, God's just trying to prevent you from truly being free, truly trying to know yourself. So you exercise your freedom against this tyrannical being called God who's preventing you from knowing your freedom. So Genesis is actually a very interesting study of the issue of what are the limits of liberty, and what happens when we misuse liberty, we lose liberty. And so the Genesis, just in Greek, means the beginning of all mess. But what you get Adam and Eve making these decisions, and then of course they lose the Eden within, but they always long to go to Eden. And one way of interpreting that is then God is very, very angry, given the fact you almost get the tyrant duty type of God. The other is to say, no, the reason I've told you not to pick from these desires is you're going to simply hurt yourself, just like you tell a child, don't put your hand in a hot burner. Puts his hand in a hot burner. It's not that a parent is trying to be authoritarian with the child. The parent just happens to know what decisions are best for making and what not, and there are consequences of making certain decisions. And so, but anyway, as a result of them losing the Eden of their inner life, which they'll always long for again, that place of inner peace, the one way of reading that, or one possible way, is that you get the angry God who comes after them to badger them to go out. The other is what, of course, Buber is going to argue in his I, Thou, is God just comes to them, they've clothed themselves, so they're beginning to hide themselves from their true being. And of course, this is the myth of clothing, is we increasingly hide ourselves in various layers of the false self that prevent us from truly knowing our true self in that sense. And so all God, in this particular section of Genesis, and Buber works this one, God just comes and says, no, where are you? Okay, you've made these decisions. You're living with these consciences. Where are you in terms of your inner life? And how do you feel about where you are? And you're hiding now, and playing this game of hide and seek, not only with yourself, your inner life, the I, Thou, I, It, but you're playing hide and seek with the other, Eve, as well, and hiding behind the tree. So you're not the tree of your soul isn't even grounded anymore. And so Buber unpacks the I, Thou, I, It issue based on theology and, again, God in humans and what that looks like based on decisions. And for Adam and Eve, did it lead to deeper peace within, or did it lead to conflict, and increasingly conflict with him? And of course, this is what's going on, and this is the source of conflict, the divided self. The self does not know the self anymore. So who am I? What decisions are worth making? What not worth making? And so the whole Genesis myth is about the impact of I, Thou, I, It as it relates to humans in a vertical sense, humans in a horizontal sense, humans within nature, and then humans in the conflicted self itself. So Buber, in terms of a very important peacemaker, his concern with what are the conditions, just as I looked at in the Beatitudes earlier in the course, what's the very structure of how we know that leads to meaningful peace? How can that be distorted and abused? And how do we recover a means that leads to just peace? And Buber, not only philosophically in I and Thou, his experience with other Jews in Germany, and then of course going to Palestine, Israel, he understood what happens when we confuse I, thou, and I, it, the injustice it leads to, the conflicts in war, and the only way to recover, or to repent, as it were, is to return to I, thou way of being and seeing and living. And that's the true way to shalom in that true Jewish sense, is rerouting where we have gone if the path leads to war and conflict, and how does the return to a deeper level of peace, and what's the role of I, thou in the four spheres of life, the vertical, the horizontal, humans in nature, and humans in their own inner journey itself.